anak-anak, untuk generasi muda, anak-anak sekolah ya, di Kota Manado. Tapi sebelum dimulai, mohon Ibu Kepala Puslit Kewilayahan LIPI, Dr. Ganiwati Puryandari untuk memberikan pengantar atau pembuka. Silakan, waktu dan tempat saya serahkan ke Ibu Dari. Silakan buka bus.
Baik, makasih Cahyo. Dengar suaranya ya?
Dengar, Bu.
Ini pakai bahasa Indonesia atau bahasa Inggris?
I'll be presenting in English, but you can
Okay.
whichever. Thank you so much.
Okay, yeah, that's fair enough. Okay, very good evening, and maybe I don't know. In America, is it nighttime or in the morning?
I'm in Europe now. I'm in France, so it's the morning.
Oh, okay, sorry. So very good evening to one and all present here, and especially good morning for you, Dr. Erika M. Larsen. Nice to meet you. Welcome. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the public talk organized by the Center for Area Studies, P2W LIPI, and American Institute for Indonesian Studies, IFIS. We are very proud to have a speaker, as already mentioned by Professor Dr. Cahyo. We have Erika M. Larsen, PhD from National University of Singapore. And if I'm not mistaken, we also have two discussions for today discussion, Dr. Edi Budiwanti and Dudin Zainuddin MA, and a moderator, Professor Dr. Cahyo Pamungkas. Thank you very much for your participation. This public talk is the first of many webinar discussion in the future held by P2W LIPI and IFIS that will be conducted monthly. And a theme for the public talks series is various related to Southeast Asian studies, ranging from religion studies, education, politics, society, ecology, culture, business, and so forth. So even though that COVID-19 has impacted to all human aspects, P2W LIPI and IFIS agree to keep building and enhancing the academic atmosphere through this activity. I think it is inspirable to our pivotal mission in promoting academic and research collaboration among scholars, especially between Indonesian and American scholars. The study of Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia, has become very important area of study for several universities and academics in America. There are so many works of their study that are phenomenal, like research by Ben Anderson, George Cahin, and Daniel Leff. Today, the topic holds special value because this is the first public talk on the construction of religious identity, religious tolerance, and religious education in North Sulawesi. A very important and interesting topic to discuss, especially with referring to the current situation. Indonesia is a country with vast diversity from ethnicity, religion, culture, cultural custom, and so forth. So I think this diversity is national wealth. However, we also know that the diversity will become opposite if all forms of differences that exist will become threats that might divide Indonesian as a nation. In the context of religious diversity, Indonesia in recent years also faced serious social and political security challenges. This is indicated by various national and international reports in recent years, success from the Wahid Institute and the Human Rights Watch, which stated that Indonesia is a country that is less in the protection of human rights, especially in interreligious relationship and religious freedom. So the speaker in this program, I think, is uniquely placed in to the debate in the context of North Sulawesi, and will highlight the key themes, trends, and current practices for the audience. Especially interesting will be the lesson learned which will be conveyed in the case of North Sulawesi. Will it be beautiful mosaic to be grateful for the diversity as a wealth of nation? This is a big question. So before coming to close of this remark, I sincerely hope you will enjoy today's public talks. Thank you for your participation, and I do hope that you are all stay safe and healthy. Thank you. So back to the moderator, Professor Cahya, please. Cahya. Cahya.
Iya, ini baru ini Mbak. Tiba-tiba saya di unmute begini. Oh ya, thank you Ibu Kapus. Terima kasih banyak. Before we starting the discussion, I would like to read the curriculum vitae of our speaker here. Let me open. Yeah, our speaker today is Dr. Erika M. Larsson. She has research interests in education, ethics, religion, politics, youth, nationalism, and religious diversity, pluralism, corruption in Indonesia and Southeast Asia. Now, she is a postdoctoral research fellow in religion and globalization cluster, Asia Research Institute, National University of Singapore. Before she was a visiting assistant professor in Department Anthropology in Hanover College, United States of America. And in 2017, 2018, she is a visiting researcher in the Center for the Study of Religion and Society, University of Notre Dame, United States of America. Dr. Erika Larsson received a PhD in cultural anthropology in Boston University. Her advisor is Dr. Robert Hefner with the dissertation entitled Civic and Religious Education in Indonesia, Ethical Deliberation about the Plural Coexistence. She received many grants and fellowship from 2013 to 2020. There are so many fellowship. The last fellowship is the CAE, Council on Anthropology and Education, Konsa del Hato Khaitan, Presidential Fellowship, American Anthropological Association. And she has also many publications. Let me read the forthcoming publication is Scaling Plural Coexistence in Manado. What does it take to remain brothers in Indonesian Pluralities, Islam, Citizenship, and Democracy, edited by Robert Hefner and Zainal Abidin Bakir, Notre Dame University Press. And also the publication in 2018 is The Developing Faith and Character to Develop the Nation, Perspective from an Elite Indonesian Catholic School in the Mission of Development, Religious and Technopolitics in Asia, edited by Catherine Scare, Philip Fountain, and Michael Fenner. And in 2017, she published in French. I don't speak French, it's very difficult. In 2017, she published L'identité catholique dans la fondation pédagogique d'une famille Sino-Indonesian in Le Christianisme and China, 19th and 2001 century, Catechesis and Formation Religieuse. These are the publication and the background of our speaker. Now, Dr. Erika Larsson would like to talk about the religious education, religious tolerance and the ethic of borders among the student in the North Sulawesi. So the time and place for use, silakan Ibu Dr. Erika Larsson, waktu selama waktu 45 menit untuk Ibu. Waktu dan tempat kami persilakan. Time and place is for use.
Thank you very much for your generous introduction. I would like to share some slides, but I think at this point it's disabled for me to share my screen. Oh, there we go. Perfect. Right. Are you able to see my slides?
Not yet.
Okay, thank you. So thank you so much for this invitation and for this opportunity to present my research today at this event that's co-organized by the American Institute for Indonesian Studies and by the Center for Area Studies at LIPI. I'm very much looking forward to our discussion and answering any questions that you may have. I'm planning to give my presentation in English, but I'm happy to try my best to answer questions in Indonesian or take questions in Indonesian as well. So I am currently a postdoctoral fellow in the Religion and Globalization cluster at the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. And I'm an anthropologist who does research in Indonesia about education, ethics, religious pluralism, and politics. So today I'd like to present my research entitled Learning to Navigate the Ethics of Boundaries, Schools, Youth, and Interreligious Relationships in North Sulawesi. So I'll just start by giving an outline of my talk for today so that you have an idea of where I'm going. I'd like to start out by giving some background about my research program, the research site, and the methods. And then I will move forward by presenting two different and seemingly contradictory or oppositional frameworks of religious coexistence that I encountered in the field while doing research in North Sulawesi. I will then elaborate both of these perspectives, taking the time to connect them to broader public debates that relate to these ethical streams in society, and also pay attention to how each of these frameworks becomes channeled through schools, understood as sites of deliberation about national belonging. I'll then consider what kind of subjectivity these frameworks would require. And so this is what I really tried to do with my research, is to link these public and collective normative frames to the level of individual and interpersonal ethical position making. Then I'll try to summarize at the end some of the contributions to debates in the anthropology of ethics and the anthropology of education. So I'll just start out by showing a map. You'll see North Sulawesi highlighted.
Excuse me, Ibu Erika, excuse me, the PowerPoint is not cannot be
Resume.
Yeah, the PPT cannot
Okay.
be. Would you like to
I will
improve
try again. Thank you for letting me know.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry.
No problem. Hold on one moment. I apologize. Are you able to see the PowerPoint now?
Not yet.
Okay. Right. I apologize. Hold on just one moment. Let me try to share a different way.
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think when I put it in a different mode, it goes out. So hopefully this is clear enough. I hope to see the slides. All right. So sorry about that, minor technical difficulty. But as you'll see, this is, of course, a map of Indonesia with North Sulawesi highlighted in orange. And since this is mostly an Indonesian audience, I won't spend too much time talking about the background. Just to mention that I did most of my research in and around the capital, the provincial capital of Manado and the nearby city of Tomohon. And of course, Manado is a city of more than 400,000 and is well known for being religiously and ethnically diverse. And in Indonesia, a majority Muslim country, the province of North Sulawesi is majority Protestant. And I've included the religious percentages of the city of Manado from the 2019 figures of Badan Pusat Statistik. So in 2019, the city of Manado was 56% Protestant, 38% Muslim, and 5% Catholic. And Buddhist, Hindu, and Confucians together made up under 1% of the population. And in North Sulawesi and in Manado, there's an intersection of religious and ethnic identity in terms of the majority of the inhabitants of the capital, the provincial capital, Manado, and the surrounding regencies are ethnic Minahasan. And ethnic Minahasans are also primarily Protestant, resulting in this kind of overlap of ethnic and religious belongings. And in terms of the provincial population, Muslims make up nearly 1/3 and are from a variety of ethnic backgrounds, some indigenous to the broader region and others present from historical and recent migration. And of course, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, as Indonesia transitioned to democracy and underwent this process of massive decentralization, there were outbreaks of ethno-religious violence that occurred in many of the provinces directly surrounding North Sulawesi. So there was violence in Central Sulawesi, in Maluku, in North Maluku, but the violence did not ultimately spread to North Sulawesi. And this is central to its current identity as a self-proclaimed exemplar of coexistence for the rest of Indonesia. And that's one of the main reasons why I selected it as my field site, in order to investigate discourses and practices related to coexistence. Right. And in terms of methodology, I did 16 months of ethnographic fieldwork from 2015 to 16 and returned for a month of follow-up research in 2018. And my research is mostly from participant observation and interviews. So you can see a photo of me interviewing a Protestant pastor about interreligious initiatives, and also below a photo of me speaking with Muslim high school students at one of the public schools where I conducted my research. And in my research, I chose to use schools as focal points. So starting research in schools and then going upstream and downstream from there to understand what kind of channeling of ethical currents takes place. And I do this because I argue that schools channel ideas and practices about belonging and religious coexistence, and that schools are sites of deliberation about the place of religion in the nation and the resulting politics of religious difference. So I decided to select 3 high schools of varying public-private status and various religious affiliation. So I selected a public high school, or SMA Negeri, a public madrasa, or Madrasa Alia Negeri, and a private Catholic high school, SMA Swasta, to do my research. And I did observation in civic and religious education courses, but I also spent time sitting in the cafeteria. I spent time in the teacher's lounge, got to know the kinds of after-school clubs that were taking place at the school, and went on many field trips with students and teachers. And so I did interviews with teachers, students, administrators, but in this going upstream and downstream, I also interviewed several political and religious leaders. And so while I recognize that there are many other relevant institutions that also contribute to socialization, I've decided to focus on schools specifically because of the way that education becomes a major arena of debate about state policies on religion. Also, anthropologist of education Amy Stambach has written about how schools transform, quote, experiences of the everyday into categories of social differentiation and identification, end quote. And schools also engage in a project of normative work that can orient towards possible frameworks of coexistence in a plural society. So now, having kind of established my approach and the methodology of my research, I sort of jumped in with these research questions in mind, really wanting to understand how frameworks for religious coexistence are channeled through schools. And then, of course, connecting this to kind of individual and interpersonal level in considering what models of subjectivity are actually at work. And just to take a moment to situate my research a bit in terms of both Indonesian and Southeast Asian studies, I'd like to point out more recent literature about this conservative turn in Indonesian Islam, which has, of course, brought up serious questions about religious coexistence in Indonesia and facilitated the use of identity politics and has often contributed to a hardening of religious boundaries. So I argue that my research demonstrates that this conservative turn must be understood within broader debates about living in a plural society. And also, my research identifies individual experiences of contextual religious boundaries, the ways in which religious boundaries can become more or less salient and distinct from different individuals' perspectives. And also, there's an emerging rich literature about ethical self-work through a religious tradition and its relation to ethnic and national identity. But my research considers not how individuals sort of do ethical self-work within a religious tradition, but how they grapple with varying ethical frameworks in a religiously plural society. All right, and now I'll move on to this paradox that I talked about before, which relates to interreligious marriage. And you might wonder how I sort of jump to interreligious marriage from looking at schools. But actually, I came across this topic because interreligious marriage is a very important lens for understanding when and how religious boundaries become salient. So anthropologies like Anne Stoller have talked about, or historians and anthropologists might have talked about how practices of inclusion and exclusion as they relate to policies about marriage and sexual relations are intimately intertwined with the political order, right? And geographer Sarah Smith has talked about how, family life and sexuality are not simply in the private sphere, but manifest as what she calls intimate geopolitics and are highly regulated by the state. So this is why I actually ended up using discourses about interreligious socializing, dating, and marriage as a way to ethnographically investigate shifting understandings of religious boundaries. And so this is the paradox that I ended up finding. Right. So the first understands Christian-Muslim intermarriage as a major foundation for religious coexistence. So because the identity in North Sulawesi, people really very much see their region as an exemplar of coexistence and like to talk about it all the time, I would often ask, what do you think actually contributes to this reality of religious harmony or peaceful coexistence? And a very common answer was the history of Christian-Muslim intermarriage, which in Bahasa Manado is referred to as kawin mawin in the region, and how this adds some kind of dimension of truth to the popular motto, Torang Samua Basudara, or we are all brothers. At the same time, I also heard many discourses which are perhaps more familiar on a national level about Christian-Muslim intermarriage as a primary threat to religious coexistence. So of course, religious intermarriage is highly contentious on a national level because of its potential for religious conversion. And while there's no specific legal proscription that prohibits interreligious marriage, bureaucratic procedures make registering such marriages nearly impossible. And as a consequence, often the bride and groom are effectively required to profess the same religion. And as you may be familiar with, in majority Muslim areas of Indonesia, interreligious marriage is often discussed as being a plot of Christianization. And among Christians in Manado, you find the reverse, where it becomes discussed as a plot of Islamization that to dampen the Christian majority and to change the religious makeup of the city and the province. And so in analyzing this paradox, I consider these attitudes about interreligious socializing, dating, and marriage of youth in Manado, as they face these sort of complex ethical norms with ambiguities on many levels. And this is why I focus on schools, as they are one arena where youth encounter mixed messages about the need to accept differences in a framework that remains premised on the recognition of and maintenance of religious boundaries. And while these two frameworks appear quite oppositional or paradoxical, as I go through this talk, I will seek to explain how individuals actually recognize both of these positions and often draw on both of these positions in navigating the realities of living in a religiously plural society. Right? And so I'll start off by talking about the first framework for coexistence, which understands Christian-Muslim intermarriage as a major foundation of peaceful coexistence in the region. And students who have religiously mixed nuclear or extended families, which is fairly common in Manado, discuss this reality as giving them some kind of practical experience with tolerance and religious coexistence. Right? So one student, Jufri, at the public madrasa told me that his grandfather actually converted to Islam. So he has some extended family members who are Christian. And so he told me that Quote, religious difference is not an obstacle to brotherhood because difference is not always bad. Difference often becomes a reason to fight, but can be a reason for peace, end quote. And the student Ella, also at the public madrasa, told me that her father had converted to Islam and that she tends to feel awkward around her Christian relatives. But the idea that her father has not always been Muslim, she said, helped her to realize that, quote, we're all the same even if we're different religions. As Manadonis say, we're all brothers, end quote. And so I widen this kind of consideration of interreligious marriage to ideas about interreligious sociality more broadly, including friendship and dating. So at all three schools where I did research, teachers often repeated their assumption that students must demonstrate tolerance by being friends with someone of a different religion. And after having observed a 10th grade class on Islamic ethics, Aqidah Akhlaq, at the public madrasa for several months, I asked students to write about an experience that they had interacting with someone of a different religion. The teacher, Ibu Indah, whose soft voice often struggled to compete with that of her students, was nevertheless enthusiastic about the topic at hand. And she made very clear her assumption that they should have non-Muslim friends. Ibu Indah teased her students, suggesting maybe some of you don't have friends of a different religion. Aisha in the front row rebutted her. Yes, everyone does. Of course they do. Ibu Indah asked if anyone had told fairy tales in their response, implying that perhaps they had made up stories. But one student, Chita, refused this accusation, explaining that indeed she had poured her heart out into her answer. Her classmates responded with snickering, but were cut off by Ibu Indah's reminder of the popular regional motto, Torang Samua Basudara, we are all brothers. I'll come back to the story of Chita later, as her situation really helps to draw out the specificities of interreligious socializing that youth are trying to navigate. But for right now, I would like to point out how this mindset for interreligious friendship as a manifestation of tolerance links up to a broader effort in the recent curriculum overhaul, particularly geared towards character education to curb rising intolerance in Indonesia. So as you may be familiar with, all teachers are now asked to evaluate students on their spiritual and social competencies, and that a general attitude and behavior of tolerance is listed as one of these core competencies for each grade level at senior high school. And civic education, for civic education, these competencies are elaborated to specifically require that students, quote, value the equality of citizens without differentiating based on race, religion, belief, gender, class, culture, and ethnicity. And in one of the civic education textbooks that I analyzed, students are asked to complete a self-evaluation to know whether or not their behavior is reflective of a good citizen. And one of the questions asks if they've ever decided not to be friends with someone because of religious difference. And this exercise is meant to show that this behavior would not be reflective of a good citizen. Some schools, including the private Catholic school where I did research, have brought this more centrally into their educational projects. So this Catholic school, which has a religiously mixed student body, it claims a specifically multicultural approach, and the teachers did spend a significant amount of time in Catholic religious education discussing the importance of respecting difference. And there was actually a student catchphrase that had taken hold, "Jangan rasis," or "don't be racist," that students use often just to encourage others not to pay attention to any forms of difference, whether religion, ethnicity, race, or friend groups when choosing friends or choosing who to spend time with. So now, having examined how this framework of coexistence links to the local identity in North Sulawesi as being an exemplar of coexistence, and also these curriculum overhaul. I ask, what kind of subjectivity does this framework of coexistence assume or require? And so I argue that this kind of framework for coexistence depends largely on an individual-oriented subjectivity, right? Where the assumption of tolerance is that it's an individual disposition or individual behavior or attitude. So we can see this in the way that it's evaluated in schools on an individual level, with the act of crossing religious boundaries through friendship viewed as a manifestation of this behavior. Right? So in this understanding of coexistence, religious boundaries are only salient insofar as they need to be overcome and ultimately ignored. And it is this model of subjectivity that underlies the assumption behind interreligious marriage as the very foundation for coexistence, right? So in this case, interreligious marriage represents a kind of ultimate commitment to crossing boundaries. And while this idea about intermarriage is clearly present in the broader society in Manado, it is not the main narrative that's promoted in religious education in schools. So it's here that I turn to the kind of second framework of coexistence, in which Christian-Muslim intermarriage is understood as a primary threat to coexistence in the region, right? And I'll again explore how this perspective becomes channeled through schools, going upstream and downstream to capture these connections to the broader public debates, as well as individual ethical position-making. So at the private Catholic school where I did research, all students were required to take Catholic religious education for at least 2 hours per week. And the standard Catholic religious education curriculum for 11th grade includes a section on marriage and family life, touching specifically on perkawinan campur, implicitly understood as referring to interreligious marriage. And during a morning class session, the Catholic religious education teacher, Pat George, an energetic man in his 30s, asked students to silently read a page out of their textbook. The text provided was a hypothetical letter written by Ibu Nelly, a Catholic woman. It was addressed to a priest, explaining her desperate situation and asking for advice. She had married a Muslim man who promised her that she could remain Catholic and that their children could be brought up as Catholic. However, after 12 years of marriage and 3 children, her husband has now given her an ultimatum to convert to Islam. If she refuses, he will request a divorce. In the letter, Ibu Nelly asks the priest whether she should remain Catholic with the risk of losing her children, or convert to Islam. And typically the examples in the religious education textbook were packaged as clearly right or wrong. But this example, in contrast, was a dilemma, lacking clues as to the best course of morally upright action. But the intended message was clear. In the words of Pat George, mixed marriages cause headaches. While some students attempted to respond to Ibu Nelly's situation, mostly advising her to get a divorce rather than convert, Pat George moved forward with a lesson, asking students to consider why mixed marriages might happen in Indonesia. He explained that Indonesia is multicultural, with many religions, skin colors, and languages living within one country. While he suggested that differences in race, ethnicity, and language could be easily overcome and did not pose any major obstacle toward marriage, he affirmed that differences in religion are more problematic. And his reasoning echoed very common concerns about interreligious marriage in terms of the difficulty that it poses for families, particularly that most parents will not agree to such a marriage for their children, and also this concern about the potential for religious conversion. Pat George reviewed the guidelines on interreligious marriage for Catholics given in the textbook. And although interreligious marriage was presented as a possibility from a Catholic perspective, there are strict guidelines, including that the Catholic spouse must remain Catholic and that both parties must agree to baptize their children in the Catholic Church. So Pat George stumbled over his words trying to summarize this position. He said, "The Church forbids, it doesn't forbid it, but it doesn't advise it either. Mixed marriage is more difficult than it is nice, but if you can love and respect each other, so be it." So I'd like to point out in Pat George's reasoning, he sort of shifts from this perspective of mixed marriage as threatening to one, so this idea of mixed marriage as threatening, which depends on an individualized understanding of tolerance. He switches from this perspective of mixed marriage as threatening to one that's more individualized, in which love between two individuals could potentially overcome potential obstacles, right? When he says, if you can love and respect each other, so be it. A few moments earlier, he had actually used an example of a harmonious interreligious celebrity couple as a kind of counterpoint to Ibu Nelly's story. And so as Pat George ended the class, he was trying to lighten the mood by going around the room and asking each student to state the religion of their boyfriend or girlfriend. This was punctuated by awkward and uncomfortable laughter, and most students hesitated as they were put on the spot, most claiming not to have a boyfriend or girlfriend, while their classmates shouted, "Ada, Ada," he has one or she has one. Pat George was quite suspicious of all of their negative responses, wondering aloud how it's possible that 90% of the students don't have a boyfriend or girlfriend. One Papuan student made everyone erupt into laughter by claiming to have a Confucian girlfriend, which everyone knew was not the case, and of course subverted expectations about dating someone from the same religious and ethnic or racial background. So from this, we can see that teachings about marriage are typically encountered in religious education class in school. And religious education often encourages selecting friends and ultimately a spouse who will strengthen one's religious identity and practice, right? So Protestant religious education encourages students to look for friends who will not draw them away from God and potentially jeopardize their salvation. And in contrast to the Catholic religious education example, Protestant and Muslim religious education don't discuss interreligious marriage as a possibility. There's a built-in assumption that students should and will marry someone of the same religion. So to link this to broader public debates, right, the majority Protestant province of North Sulawesi, Christians in this province, Christians often feel that Islam is encroaching in the region and that intermarriage must be a part of this expansionist agenda. And many Christians do have a strong conviction that the region must maintain a strong Christian presence and identity in the region. And as a result, there are many discourses about the dangers of interreligious socializing, dating, and marriage that are, of course, present on a national level, as well as in North Sulawesi. And there are some surveys that have been conducted in Indonesia about attitudes towards interreligious socializing and dating and marriage. One of the largest ones was conducted by Parker Hoon and Rahani. They surveyed over 3,000 high school students in different areas of Indonesia and found that the majority of Indonesian youth, about 73%, claim to have friends of another religion, and that even a sizable minority, 32%, claimed to have already had a boyfriend or girlfriend of another religion. Yet at the same time, only 6.6% said they would agree with interreligious marriage. And I'd like to point out that, especially from the perspective of youth, these kind of categories, particularly between friendship and dating, are not always so clear-cut, right? When does friendship actually turn into dating? And so one Protestant student at the public school who I talked to explained that she is actually sort of afraid of socializing with her Muslim classmates, especially boys, because of the possibility of romance. And so she said, quote, "I don't want to get too close. I'm afraid. Who knows? I could like them because we're still teenagers." And so once again, I'd like to consider what kind of subjectivity this framework for coexistence assumes or requires. And I argue that it depends on, instead of an individual-oriented subjectivity, it depends on a more community-oriented subjectivity, where in this case, calls for tolerance are framed in terms of group belonging rather than individual disposition and attitudes. Right? So in this understanding, it's important to know about other religions, to be able to respect the boundaries of religious communities. So here, the role of individuals is to have a strong sense of religious values, which will, from an Indonesian perspective, necessarily involve teachings of tolerance. And that tolerance can only happen when individuals have this strong religious conviction and are fully aware of and respect the boundaries of religious communities, which would be fundamentally threatened by interreligious marriage. And so I'd like to go back to the story of Chita that I mentioned at the beginning. Back at the public madrasa, I had asked students to write about their experiences with people from different religious backgrounds. And while the papers were anonymous, Chita, who had reported to the class that she poured her heart out into her answer, came to talk to me after class in an interaction that was closely monitored by her classmates. Before she could start talking to me, her friend pointed to her and loudly blurted out, "DP cowok Kristen," or in Bahasa Manado, right, meaning she has a Christian boyfriend. For the teacher, Inda, having friends of a different religion was clearly something expected of her students. But Chita's case of dating a Christian boy was perceived by her peers as inappropriate and sanctioned through teasing. And so I'd like to read out my translation of what she wrote. And so she wrote, "My experience with people of a different religion is that I have lots of friends of a different religion, and we are good friends, already like family. And honestly, now I am also in a relationship with a boy of a different religion. It's true, a lot of friends often tease me because they know about my relationship, but I don't care about them. I continue to follow my heart because I really do love him. He is a boy who makes my life happy every day. But I'm surprised by my friends. Why do they often tease me like that? Because in my opinion, as long as we have a proper relationship, there's nothing wrong with it. Truly, I love him, and I'm not going to pay attention to what my friends say. But now he's gone to follow his dreams. Now he's in Makassar. He is going to a Christian school there, and it's been torture these past 2 months, and nobody cares. I'm still willing to wait for him to return so we can follow the dream that we have planned together. But I am confused. He and I have different religions. Am I the one who has to be willing to give up my religion? Because up until now, he is not willing to follow my religion, and I am confused. But that's not a problem because we have not yet planned marriage, and I'm still in school. I believe that if we are soulmates, we will surely be united despite having different religions. I just hope there's a way out. And it's not possible for me to leave him because my heart is already sealed to his. What I want now is for him to come back to be with me because I'm sad when he's gone for too long. And hopefully he is fine there. I also hope for the best." So I'd like to point out how in navigating personal relationships, as Chita is doing, the salience of religious boundaries is constantly shifting based on this balancing act between these two different modes of subjectivity that I've explained and sort of uncovered. As youth seek a sense of self and also a sense of how they fit into their religious community. So consider the case of Chita in her confusion over her romantic relationship with a Christian boy. So she's seeking personal fulfillment through this romantic relationship. She also kind of draws attention to her personal tolerance in terms of having friends and a boyfriend of a different religious background. But she also experiences this as a source of tension among her peers and when she considers her responsibility as a Muslim. And the consequences of this balancing act are significant because, as I've shown, they project the manifestation of tolerance in significantly different ways. And so as youth balance these two modes of subjectivity, they're also navigating, different possibilities for approaching interreligious relationships where religious boundaries become more or less salient, and also the way to approach them as a tolerant individual and a tolerant member of a faith community shifts as well. So just to sort of underscore this argument, right, the assumption of ignoring or crossing religious boundaries is seen as an expression of this individual disposition of tolerance, where group level belonging can sort of be forgotten or bracketed out. But this community-oriented perspective also figures about making decisions in sort of interreligious socializing, and is influenced by fears of conversion, assuming that tolerance is only possible through a clear emphasis on and communal recognition of boundaries. So these two frameworks for coexistence that appeared kind of paradoxical or oppositional at the beginning, in their most extreme versions, they do have fundamentally different ideas about the importance of boundary maintenance in religious coexistence. Right? So framing interreligious marriage as the foundation of tolerance emphasizes the need for fluidity of boundaries in sustaining this social fabric. On the other hand, interreligious marriage, framed as a major threat to coexistence, draws on the need to stabilize and maintain boundaries. And this educational system, which has encouraged students to mix with religious others as part of a multicultural project, has perhaps in some ways allowed them to see religious boundaries as less solid. But at the same time, youth are reminded, and as we saw in the case of Chita, they remind each other about the dangers of interreligious marriage and the importance of maintaining and reinforcing religious boundaries. So considering the level of public debate and how these ideas become channeled through schools, it becomes clear that these ambiguities and this kind of paradox exists not only at the level of individual ethical reflection, but at multiple kind of societal levels, right? And both frameworks of coexistence become invoked by individuals as they navigate the realities of living in a plural society, balancing these modes of subjectivity, right? So in negotiating personal relationships, the salience of religious boundaries is constantly shifting based on this balancing act between these two modes of subjectivity, right? As youth like Chita and her peers seek a sense of self and how they fit in with their religious community, right? And as I've pointed out, right, as youth draw on these different modes, they must navigate different possibilities for approaching interreligious relationships. And so I'd just like to end by pointing out some of the contributions that I hope to make with this case study into the literature of the anthropology of ethics and the anthropology of education. And it's my hope that this kind of analysis of the multi-leveled interactions that take place in shaping ethical dispositions can exemplify how these political and broad societal level discourses impact the ways in which religious difference is understood and subsequently enacted among Indonesian youth. So in the anthropology of ethics, my study contributes to this kind of understanding of ethical pluralism and ambiguity as central to the human experience, and not necessarily experienced as a kind of moral dilemma. While some scholars have suggested that moral systems are consistent and rationalized, and that it is instances of moral breakdown which cause people to reflect on ethical systems. So my research tends to show that there are kind of coexisting aspirational realms, that many people draw on both of these different frameworks of coexistence and do not necessarily experience them as contradictory. And instead of remaining at the level of subjectivity, I've paid attention to the role of institutions, in this case, schools, which have to date been largely absent in the theoretical debates on ethics, right? And it's my goal to demonstrate the role of institutions like schools, but also others, in linking public ethical currents to instances of interpersonal ethical reflection. So the way that I've done this is by drawing on understandings of education as deliberation that relate also to the pedagogical nature of ethical reflection, or right, what James Laidlaw has called the ability to manage conflicts between these and other demands through reflective and thoughtful self-direction. So I do hope that applying and ethnographically fleshing out this model of education as deliberation can help to inform an understanding of ethical reflection that moves beyond ethics as a simple internalization of values and views it as a contingent and fundamentally pedagogical process. So I'd like to thank you all for listening to my talk. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing your response and answering any questions that you might have.
Terima kasih, thank you very much, Ibu Erika Larsson, for interesting presentation and sharing the result of the research in Northern Sulawesi. Now we enter the question and answer session. I saw in the chatting, Pak Dudin, do you still in the Zoom? Halo, Pak Dudin masih ada nggak ya? Udah pergi ya? Oke. Yeah, because we invited one or two researcher to respond the presentation of Ibu Erika, but both of them did not attend. So, but before we enter the question and answer, I would like to make a summary of the presentation in bahasa Indonesia. Ya, Ibu Erika, please allow me to speak in bahasa Indonesia. Ya, pertama, ya, Ibu Erika presentasinya adalah memfokuskan pada aspek dari konservatif turn, ya. Konservatif turn ini mungkin bagi Bapak Ibu yang belum mengetahui adalah pergeseran orientasi keagamaan, ya, dari praktek keagamaan yang tradisional menjadi lebih tekstual, ya, menjadi lebih konservatif. Nah, Ibu Erika di sini membahas mengenai contextual nature, ya, kontekstual dari konteks-konteks dari model toleransi dan hubungan dan religious boundaries, batas-batas dalam hubungan beragama. Kemudian Ibu Erika juga memfokuskan pada kerangka etik, ya, yang ya dikontestasikan, ya. Tadi dalam kesimpulannya beliau mengatakan ada dua hal, yaitu subjektivitas yang berbasis pada individu dan subjektivitas yang berbasis pada komunal. Itu dua kerangka etis yang dikontestasikan. Kemudian Ibu Erika juga menjelaskan mengenai adanya paradoks dari pernikahan antar umat beragama ya. Pada satu sisi perkawinan antar umat beragama menjadi bukti dari adanya keharmonisan ya antar umat beragama atau religious coexistence. Coexistence bisa diterjemahkan ke dalam hidup berdampingan secara damai antar umat beragama. Tetapi pada sisi lain pernikahan antar umat beragama itu cenderung menjadi ancaman yang mendasar dari religious coexistence karena adanya kekhawatiran konversi, pindah ke agama lain. Kemudian dalam riset beliau yang telah dilakukan itu, ya beliau telah menemukan berbagai praktek-praktek ya, adanya misalnya female student, pelajar yang beragama Islam kemudian memiliki pacar yang beragama Kristen, atau pelajar yang beragama Kristiani memiliki pacar yang beragama Islam, dan itu ya dikhawatirkan menimbulkan dilema ya, seperti yang disampaikan Ibu Erika bahwa mixed marriage, perkawinan antar umat beragama seringkali menyebabkan headache ya, menyebabkan sakit kepala atau dilema, karena pada satu sisi akan ada kekhawatiran yang satu harus yang berpindah pada agama yang satunya, kalau tidak tadi dikatakan diancam untuk diceraikan. Ya, mixed marriage is nice but difficult ya. Menurut temuan tersebut. Namun Bu Erika, kalau kita melihat di Provinsi Papua bagian barat, Papua Barat ya, seperti di Fak-Fak dan Kaimana, itu telah tumbuh tradisi yang bernama agama keluarga atau family religion. Nah, dulu pada masa lalu, pada awal-awal penyebaran agama Kristiani, pada awal abad ke-19 bahkan sampai tahun 1900, dari awal abad ke-20 sampai tahun 1980-an, dalam satu keluarga di Fak-Fak dan Kaimana misalnya, anggota keluarganya bisa beragama Kristen, bercampur dengan Katolik, bercampur dengan Islam, sehingga di daerah Fak-Fak dan Kaimana itu seringkali disebut sebagai tradisi agama keluarga. Mereka ya itu ya, saling menghormati, saling menghargai satu sama lain, dan tidak ada masalah pada waktu itu. Nah, kemudian temuan yang lain adalah ya refleksi beliau mengenai subjektivitas, apakah seringkali ada ambigu ya, antara subjektivitas berbasis individu dan subjektivitas berbasis komunal di dalam pernikahan antar umat beragama. Mungkin saya menambahkan ya, temuan disertasi dari Jeremy Mencek ya, tahun 2015. Jeremy Mencek published his dissertation in 2015. He talked about the tolerance without pluralism. In bahasa, ya, very easy in bahasa to explain ya, bahwa toleransi di Indonesia, toleransi antar umat beragama di Indonesia itu lebih didasarkan atas atas penghargaan, penghormatan terhadap komunalitas. Ini berbeda dengan toleransi yang berbasis individu seperti yang ada di negara-negara Barat, yang didasarkan atas penghormatan hak-hak individual. Ini juga terkait dengan perbedaan mengenai hak perlindungan hak dasar antara individu dan komunal, yang di Indonesia itu lebih kuat komunalitasnya daripada individualitasnya. Mungkin dari buku Jeremy Mencek kita bisa mengetahui bahwa toleransi yang berkembang di Indonesia adalah toleransi without liberalisme dan toleransi yang berbasis pada perlindungan hak komunal umat beragama daripada toleransi yang berbasis individual. Kemudian juga saya ingin menambahkan sedikit, saya dalam disertasi saya, in my dissertation in 2015, I also conducted a survey in Ambon in Yogyakarta to 1,500 university students in Ambon in Yogyakarta by random sampling. And one of my question is about the avoidance of interreligious marriage. Avoidance of interreligious marriage. So I use the Bogadu scale. The question is, would you like to accept people from other religion to become your spouse? Dan and the result is 98% ya. 97%, 97% di Maluku dan di Yogyakarta rejected the interreligious marriage. Kemudian menurut analisa regresi, salah satu intermediate variabelnya adalah monisme, ya, suatu attitude toward religious plurality yang berasumsi bahwa kebenaran itu hanya ada pada agamanya sendiri dan tidak pada agama yang lain. Jadi religious monisme itu menjadi faktor yang sangat kuat untuk menentukan itu, untuk mempengaruhi penolakan terhadap interreligious marriage. Demikian Ibu Erika. Nah, selanjutnya saya akan membuka kesempatan bagi Bapak atau Ibu atau audiens yang pendapatnya. Silakan host untuk di unmute. Saya ingin mendengarkan suara dari Bapak Ibu sekalian.
Ya, saya ada izin bertanya untuk Dr. Erika, tapi bisa dalam bahasa Inggris, Pak Cahyo. Halo.
Yes, go ahead. Sorry, I was not able to unmute myself, and I think we have lost Pak Cahyo, unfortunately.
Dear Dr. Erika, can I go straight for the question to you regarding the research? Thank you. So thank you for the presentation. I'm really interested to further read about your research. My question is that, from the sociological point of view, how do you see the majority rule and minority consent affect the paradox that you have found from the current research that you have done? And if so, for further research, would you be interested to investigate the provinces in Indonesia where Islam is more dominant as a means to compare and contrast between both findings? Because to some extent, religious piety might be affected to the geopolitical and cultural background. So I hope the question is clear, and I really want to inquire deeper on that. And thank you, Dr. Erika, for the chance.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question about this kind of minority and majority dynamic and how much that impacts the situation. And I think it has a huge impact. So I mentioned very briefly at the beginning of the talk that there is a kind of overlapping between ethnic Minahasan identity and Protestant Christian identity. And this has unfortunately been mobilized by some groups in North Sulawesi to promote a very exclusivist identity or kind of understanding of belonging in North Sulawesi. And actually in one of the schools where I conducted my research in a public high school, you could see kind of aspects of this circulating within the school as well, where there's a kind of what I call a de facto majoritarianism, which sort of assumes that Protestantism is the norm and requires other students to kind of adapt to this norm, right? So I was actually surprised to find this tendency to mobilize the kind of local majoritarianism of having this Christian majority to kind of promote, in some cases, a kind of more exclusivist identity. So I'm not sure if that's sort of clear or not, but I think that it does have a huge difference. And although, Protestants are a religious minority in Indonesia, the fact that they are a local majority in North Sulawesi, I think has a major impact in how this plays out. And while my upcoming research is not related to interreligious marriage, it's actually more about attitudes towards corruption. I do hope to do interviews in different areas of Indonesia. And I think this kind of sociological background and this majority-minority dynamic, I think, will be a very important thing to take into account when conducting this kind of multi-sided research in Indonesia.
All right, thank you, Dr. Erika. Could I ask for one last question to follow up? So do you think that education, especially schools, as the major device or place, can be as the source for religious coexistence and tolerance, and might be conflict at the same time? Do you see that school have this major impact towards the religious coexistence in Indonesia, or maybe in other places that you have done your research? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you again for your question. So as someone who does research on education, it's very interesting. The kind of popular assumption of education is often either that it's very conservative, that it just kind of reproduces the main viewpoints in society, or another assumption is often that it's going to sort of change everything and fix all of our problems for the future. Right, and I don't think that it's necessarily either of those, right? It's sort of, I think schools can definitely and should definitely be mobilized in order to, promote some kind of understanding of coexistence. But one of the things that I found in my research is actually, right, as I presented, that there's multiple understandings of coexistence being kind of taught at the same time. That not only just in the curriculum, but in my other work, I talk about just the policies of the school in terms of how they organize worship spaces for different religions, in the school, right? So all of these aspects in schools can really contribute to this normative work in terms of what kind of ethical frameworks are made available for youth to make sense of their own identity and their relationship to others in general. So I think schools do play a very important role, but it's often not so straightforward or simple in terms of just transmitting one kind of perspective, because there are often many perspectives being transmitted at the same time through the curriculum, as well as the school policies, as well as peer-peer interaction, and that's just within the school and not even considering other other sites of socialization in the broader society.
Hello, Mas Cahyo. Are you there, Mas Cahyo?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Network is not good. I'm very much Pak Sin Patrick. Apakah ada yang mau bertanya? Tadi di chat ada Mas Fahri ya, Bung Fahri Idol saya. Silakan Fahri untuk menyampaikan secara langsung. Halo Fahri, halo. Pak bisa ya? Sambil menunggu Fahri, ada yang mau bertanya, Bapak Ibu sekalian, silakan disampaikan. Nah, Ibu sekalian, apakah ada yang mau menyampaikan pertanyaan? Silakan.
Yeah.
Halo.
Hello.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Enrico.
Oh yeah, silakan.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I have a few questions. Thank you for your presentation, and I found that some very interesting point you've been raised in the research, and I have a few questions I want to ask you about your opinions. Have you ever it's come close, if you look at the issue, what's happened, you do your research in the field work, which is, if you look at the, from the macro level, which is the Indonesia, the state policy, when we're talking about, we do know Indonesia is a multicultural society, but as you also have to aware that in the state policy, which is they conduct so-called the pluralism, rather than multiculturalism as ideologies, which is these two ideologies very different. As you based in Singapore, you should know the multiculturalism policy is very different from a pluralism, cultural pluralism, or religious pluralism. So since that Indonesia haven't changed or transitioned from so-called the plural society into a multicultural society, those ideologies still very different. So it makes sense when you conduct the research in such a local area, and the people haven't changed their perception, how to towards the idea. Like today, we see, the subjectivity. They have a conflict with the subjectivity, which is they haven't know this is such as called, what do you see, the religion first, or you see the ethnicity first? So when you see yourself as an ethnicity first, so there's no conflict when you get into the interreligious marriage. But if you see the religion first, it might be the paradox like you raised. That's a very difficult to convince themselves, which is we see ourselves. We don't see it's an intersubjectivity. The relationship is not existed, which is very referred to what's the state policy, which is the religious pluralism. And that's what I see from your research. And I found it also very interesting to look at the state policy from the macro level. And also would like to suggest or have him aware, because I do know that's the UGM, Gajah Mada University, which is they also conduct a lot of training now, so-called the interreligious education, which is trying to overcome what is already happened in Indonesia. The relationship between the religion, it's still very much lag behind. So they have been conduct a lot of training in different regions in Indonesia, include Sulawesi. So hopefully it's also the one that inside, which is we were looking for to see the transition or the change in Indonesian society. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. Yes, thank you so much for your question and for some of those insights and comparing also, with Singaporean ideas about multiculturalism and so forth. And I do think that, state policies are very, very important. And at the same time, we can't assume that we understand how individuals understand them and how they impact individuals in their daily lives. So we can't just necessarily assume that having a different kind of governmental policy or perspective will necessarily, produce a certain attitude or response in the broader society. And I think your comment as well about, ethnicity first and religion first is very important, because of course I've focused here on religious boundaries, but religion and ethnicity intersect in very important ways, as well as with other things like class status. Can be very important, right? So it's not, of course, just religion that people are considering when thinking about who to be friends with, or who to date or who to marry. And I think it's also not necessarily just a matter of who am I first? Am I first, a member of this ethnic group or a member of this religious group? But I think, as is true for all of us, that it sort of depends on the context, which of those identities becomes or it sort of comes to the fore. And so that's sort of what I'm trying to draw out, to show that, in different situations, individuals are drawing on these different kind of understandings of subjectivity, either focusing, more on themselves as individuals, and how do I, as an individual, demonstrate that I'm a tolerant person. But then, in other contexts, well, I'm also a member of this faith community. So how do I, strengthen my identity as a religious person, and also kind of respond to others, while kind of maintaining that my own religious identity. And so I think, it is sort of a matter of which identity first, but that it also depends on which context you're actually talking about. And it's not necessarily the same across all contexts. So that's sort of what I was trying to draw attention to in that case. So I hope that that's at least answered part of your question, and I really appreciate you asking a question.
Yeah. Thank you, Ibu Erika and Pak Cilangasan ya. Selanjutnya mungkin Ibu Kapus mau menyampaikan secara langsung sebelum saya membacakan pertanyaan. Before I read the question from YouTube, maybe Ibu Kapus, would you like to speak directly to deliver your question? Please, time and place is Ibu Kapus.
Okay.
Ya, silakan.
Yeah, thank you, Cahyo, and thank you very much, Erika, for your presentation. Well done. I'm wondering that you have already talked a lot about your research, and you mentioned that your research is carried out to some school in North Sulawesi. However, I'm wondering whether, do you have any data, how much the percentage of people getting married between religion in North Sulawesi? I think if you have a data, that kind of data, will be interesting. What I mean is to bridging the gap between your minor research and to the macro level of the research, between the perspective of the student in the school about intermarriage and about the reality, whether intermarriage is indeed primary threat for religious coexistence, for example, in the society in North Sulawesi. So I'm very interested if you can comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's a very important question. And so I have some data. I did not collect data of my own, but there is some data from a paper from Aini Utomo, I believe, and et al., she has collected data about the incidence of interreligious marriage across Indonesia, across all of the provinces. And of course, it's very difficult to capture statistically. So their data can only capture cases in which you have two different religions currently under one household, right? So it cannot capture cases in which one person converts to marry. It can only capture, cases in which someone has perhaps converted to marry and then converts back or never converts. And so in that way, it is slightly limited because it cannot capture sort of all of what we might consider as interreligious marriage. But I believe, I hope I'm not making a mistake, but from my memory, I think the incidence of interreligious marriage in Indonesia as a whole is like 0.5%. So it's quite low. And in North Sulawesi, it's about twice that, around 1%. So it's higher, but still, only about 1%, at least that can be captured in terms of this census statistics. So I think hopefully that can at least help to give some kind of context in terms of the rate of interreligious marriage does seem to be higher in North Sulawesi than in other regions, but that overall it's still very a small minority of cases.
Thank you, Ibu Erika. Yeah, although the percentage of interreligious marriage is small, but it is very important to be investigated. It is not a common phenomena in Indonesia. But my obsession, when I stay in Netherlands for my PhD, interreligious marriage is for example, in woman and the Dutch man, or between the Turkish or Moroccan man to the Dutch woman, or etc. And the issue of religion is not alliance. In Indonesia, that this is not a common phenomenon, that it is a unique phenomenon to be studied. Ibu Kapus masih ada tambahan?
Untuk yang lainnya saja dulu, silahkan.
Ya, terima kasih. Ada a question from Saiful Ham. Ya. Mohon izin bertanya, penelitian Dr. Apakah ada tentang pernikahan calon Muslim menjadi Kristen, atau mungkin sebaliknya calon pengantin Kristen maaf, hilang lagi saya.
Okay, I think I'll go ahead and respond because I can see the question here in the chat. So I actually don't have that kind of data, but I do know if that's something that you're interested in, this more statistics about interreligious marriage, pernikahan beda agama. I know there are several researchers at IAIN Manado who are also doing research on this topic that I have been in touch with, and they might have more information specifically about these kinds of cases of interreligious marriage. So I would definitely encourage you to get in touch with them if you'd like to follow up about that. And I can also put you in touch with some of those researchers at IAIN Manado, and maybe also at Universitas Samratulangi in Manado.
From YouTube, I'm often throw out from the Zoom. Ya. Pertanyaan dari chat, mohon izin bertanya, dalam penelitian ulama or to influence interreligious marriage in North Sulawesi. This is from Lukmanul Hakim. Do you need
I apologize, it's breaking up quite a bit, so I wasn't able to get the whole question. Is it in the chat? I'm trying to find it in the chat.
Yeah. Halo, apakah suara saya?
It's quite difficult to hear.
Okay. In your research, the question is, your research find intermarriage in North Sulawesi, or maybe the host can help me to deliver it, because my network, internet network is not good.
Ms. Erika?
Yes.
Okay, I will read the question. In your research, do you find any lecture of local ulama or priests to influence intermarriage in North Sulawesi? From Lukman Hakim.
Yeah, so I think that's a very important question, and one perhaps that my research is not best positioned to answer, since I really focused on schools as a center of socialization. right? And how these messages transmitted through schools are going to impact. But of course, you know, different mosques and churches are also very important centers of socialization that I think also need to be examined in terms of what kind of frameworks of coexistence are being circulated in these contexts as well. So I don't think my research is, you know, best positioned to answer that, but I can sort of give a case from this school. So at one of the public schools where I did research, the Islamic religious education teacher often talked about this historical intermarriage in North Sulawesi, and was kind of encouraging the students to be proud of this legacy of religious harmony. So not encouraging or sort of influencing students to, you know, marry someone of a different religion, no, but kind of emphasizing this as part of the framework for coexistence. But, you know, of course, at the same time, he's teaching the national curriculum, which, you know, encourages students to find friends that will sort of help them in their own religious piety, and also, you know, unequivocally to marry someone who is also Muslim. So it's not as if there was sort of a clear kind of view of intermarriage as a positive thing. Not at all. It was seen in this context of providing some kind of framework for coexistence, but at the same time, right, students were always kind of encouraged to find a marriage partner who is also Muslim.
Okay.
So there is a revision from, it means interreligious. Is there any lecture or priest, or might be the one who have authority to influence interreligious marriage in North Sulawesi?
I'm sorry, could you repeat one more time so I can make sure that I got the question?
Do you find any lecture of local ulama or priest to influence interreligious marriage in North Sulawesi?
Okay, so I think I at least tried to just answer that question, to say that, right, I focused mostly on the schools. So I didn't, of course, I visited different religious communities, but didn't necessarily focus on those kinds of teachings, rather, you know, looking at them in schools. But that perhaps my research is not the best position to say, you know, how much, you know, local ulamas or priests are kind of influencing this idea of intermarriage.
Iya, thank you Ibu Erika. Apakah sudah didengar lagi? Halo?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, the last question is repeating the previous question. Yeah. Okay. If I would like to ask the audience, are there still any questions? Any question? Yeah, maybe there is one.
Boleh tanya, Cahyo? Cahyo?
Yeah, please.
Cahyo, can I ask question?
Ya, Ibu.
Silakan.
Thank you.
Yes, silakan.
So, thank you, Ibu Adika. It's very interesting presentation. I just want to ask a simple question. If you compare between different religion like Muslim and Christian, which one is actually more tolerant for intermarriage? And also the second question is, if I think this is because I think religion, especially religious identity, Islamic identity, is stronger than before. So if you compare between maybe before 1980 to now, whether there is a different like percentage of the intermarriage or the perspective of the intermarriage among different religions, especially among the Muslim people. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll start first with the last question that you asked about this change over time. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's from the same article from Aini Utomo et al., where they actually compare data for different generations in terms of how the incidence of interreligious marriage has changed over the past few decades. And they found that actually it's decreasing. So it's becoming less common to have interreligious marriage sort of on a national level. So I don't have the specific data for North Sulawesi, but that's sort of interesting as well, especially because youth are often seen as being kind of more like liberal or progressive, whereas in this case, it seems like at least younger generations, in this case, still, generations that have already mostly gotten married, are actually less likely to have an interreligious marriage. So I think that's quite interesting, especially in this context about talking about youth, that it seems it has perhaps gotten less common. And as Pak Cahayo shared about his own research, right, 97 of the students rejected the idea of interreligious marriage, which is quite interesting in thinking about this change, this perhaps a change over time. And then in your first question, I'm afraid it's quite difficult to answer, especially without essentializing religion. So I don't want to essentialize, Christianity or Islam and say that one is necessarily more tolerant than another in terms of interreligious marriage. And I think it does depend a lot. Of course, it depends on religious teachings, but it also depends a lot on the social context as well, in terms of how much interreligious marriage is tolerated. And just as a quick example off the top of my head, in Indonesia, Protestant Catholic marriage is considered interreligious marriage, whereas in perhaps another social context like the US, this is not seen as an interreligious marriage. So just to point out that, of course, there are religious teachings about intermarriage that are quite important in shaping social values, but that's not the only thing that's shaping how much people engage in intermarriage or how much people accept intermarriage. And I think the social situation is quite important in shaping attitudes about whether or not that's kind of acceptable and appropriate.
Ya, terima kasih Ibu Erika. Ibu Yekti masih ada pertanyaan? Kalau tidak, saya akan bacakan bagian dari chat. Ibu Yekti sudah cukup, Bu, ya? Halo, Prof. Yekti? Halo? Baik, Ibu Erika, ada lagi satu, there is one question again from, oh ya, Bu Yekti, ya, silakan. Masih ada.
Okay. I think it's okay. Maybe it's quite difficult, but because you are anthropologist, so I expect that you may have detailed information. Like for instance, when you talk with the young people, maybe you have also sense that, as I mentioned before, also because I think it's from Islamic identity is stronger, and also actually in Islam, I think men and women also have different perspective. Like for men, because they are expected to bring the women to be a Muslim, but for women it's very difficult because maybe women will follow something like that. So my question maybe because I expect that you have some details, but it's okay. Maybe it's quite sensitive also. Thank you anyway, Ibu Erika.
Thank you.
Okay, terima kasih. Thank you very much, Professor Yekti Maulati, for the question. Yeah. and in one side can be regarded as the tool, and the inside is the threat of conversion into other religion. There is one question from Dr. Erika. Compare with the public school in the United States, are the public there here?
It's cutting out quite a bit, but I think I found the question on the chat that's comparing asking to compare public schools in the US with public schools in Indonesia and kind of the similarities and differences. And I think there are major differences in how just secularism in general is kind of emphasized and enacted in the US versus in Indonesia, where, you know, in the US, a public school means that there should be no kind of religious activities, language, etc. Right, so, and someone in the chat has just added this kind of separation of church and state. That being said, it's not always enacted in the same way all across the US. In some areas which are particularly religious, like I'm thinking in the South, where like the Baptist church is quite strong, you might have public schools where it's considered quite normal to kind of pray at school. Whereas in in most public school contexts, that would be considered kind of unacceptable for a teacher or a student to lead a prayer in a public school, because it's understood as needing to provide some kind of neutral space in a public school. Right, and so I think, of course, you all are more familiar with the Indonesian context where education is seen as something that should necessarily include religious education as a very important step in character development, right? As well as, just in terms of religious education, and that there's no kind of contestation that the state should kind of be involved in providing that in public schools. Whereas in the US, religious groups would not, I don't think they would ever agree to have the state be in charge of kind of disseminating religious education, because many religious groups would see that as infringing upon the rights of religious groups if the state would then try to take control of religious education. So at least, it's a big question, but at least hopefully that answer kind of points to some of the main points of similarity and difference.
Okay, thank you, Ibu. Tolong di host, tolong di unmute. Apakah mau menyampaikan secara langsung? Silakan Pak Daeng Marala. Oh, nggak ada suara ya. Kalau begitu, kalau sudah tidak ada lagi pertanyaan, diskusi akan saya tutup ya. Once again, thank you very much. Terima kasih banyak. A million thanks to Ibu Dr. Erika Larsson for the interesting lecture, and this is very interesting topic in this afternoon. Yeah, this interreligious marriage is, although it is not a common phenomena, but it's very important to be studied, to be investigated, because this become one to evaluate the cohesion in Indonesia. Bapak Ibu sekalian, jika masih memiliki pertanyaan lain dapat disampaikan melalui email ke beliau, yaitu EM ya, EMLARSON Larson ya @bu.edu ya. Silakan bagi Bapak Ibu yang tertarik dalam studi Interreligious Marriage dan Social Cohesion dan sebagainya menghubungi Ibu Dika Larson. Bapak Ibu sekalian, saya menyampaikan terima kasih banyak kepada semua yang hadir atas partisipasinya dan atas kesediaannya untuk mendengarkan kuliah yang sangat penting ini. Selanjutnya waktu saya kembalikan pada Pak Paulus Rudolf Juniarto ya untuk menutup. Silakan Paulus. Paulus, halo, Bung Paulus. Ayu, silakan untuk menutup.
Terima kasih Pak Cahyo ya. Saya rasa kalau dari kami mungkin mengucapkan terima kasih banyak atas kesediaan Ibu Erika Larson untuk berbicara dan memberikan lecture di forum ini gitu ya. Saya juga mau sedikit memberi tahukan bahwa acara ini terselenggara berkat kerjasama antara Pusat Penelitian Kewilayahan dengan IFIS, American Institute for Indonesian Studies. Di sini kebetulan ada Mas Anas Bentari yang menjadi perwakilan dari IFIS. Mungkin sedikit nanti bisa bicara di penutupan. Jadi saya tidak banyak saya tidak mengulang apa yang sudah disampaikan dari presentasi ini. Jadi saya ucapkan terima kasih dan terima kasih kepada Cahyo yang sudah memoderatori acara ini dan kepada rekan-rekan yang sudah hadir dalam pertemuan ini. Terima kasih.
Thank you very much.
Mas Anas, ada yang mau disampaikan, Mas?
Saya rasa cukup. Terima kasih. Terima kasih, Erika.
Dari Ibu Dari mungkin ada yang mau disampaikan?
In any case, thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to doing more research in Indonesia. So I hope, I look forward to any collaborations in the future.
Terima kasih Bu Erika. Thank you very much. Hopefully you will be joined in another discussion. We are looking forward for you again. See you. Thank you so much for all the participants, and also Pak Paul and Mbak Ayu who helped to this event. So, and also from the IFIS, thank you so much too. So hopefully we will see you again for the next public talk series held by P2W and IFIS. And the information I think can find in our social media network. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a nice evening.
Thank you so much all.
Thank you, Miss Erika.
Goodbye.